What did they do to noblewomen captured by the Sultan? The answer hides in steam, in ledgers, and in names that were scratched out. The Hammam is hot. Steam curls against gilded tiles. A single disciplined light falls through a small high window and picks out beads on a wrist. She kneels on the marble, wrapped in damp linen that clings to skin and history. Around her stand figures in plain robes and court dress. A steward holding a folded strip of paper, a scribe with an ink-stained reed, an attendant with a small brass token. Someone speaks a formula, someone else nods and writes. Later, a page is turned. A name is crossed out. Years from now, a cuff will be found with a different name stitched into the seam. This is the scene that opens the file we are calling the Forbidden Ottoman Ritual. The scene is a reconstruction, pieced from patterns we find in archives, from comparative records, and from the fragments of lives that survive. But it is also a lens, how bureaucracies turn intimacy into property. Why does this matter? Because ritual, when performed by institutions, does more than mark a moment. It reclassifies a person. It changes what law records, how kinship is recognized, who inherits what, and which names remain in the public memory. Our question is not only what happened in a bathhouse centuries ago. It is how institutions used ritual to convert bodies into entries, and how that conversion echoes through generations. In this episode, we will confront fragments: a cuff, a smudged register, letters stuffed into a seam. We will trace a pattern: renaming, token exchange, ledger entry, and erasure, and ask whether a ritual like the one we reconstruct was used in Ottoman context to the same effect. Where direct Ottoman documentation is absent or ambiguous, I will be clear. The claim is a reconstruction, an analogy, or flagged indefinito for specialist verification. If this thread matters to you, subscribe now to follow more unsealed files like this one. To begin, we need to understand the basic logic: archives as agents. A ledger is not neutral. A line in a register does not merely record, it authorizes. Names written on official pages become the categories through which rights, duties, rations, and reputations are defined. In many institutional settings, imperial courts, plantations, religious houses, official ceremonies, and administrative acts work together. A public ritual made a private status legible to bureaucrats. A notation in the scribe's book made that status legible to courts. Put another way, ritual and record formed a system that could make a person legible as property, dependent, or citizen. Much of our working pattern comes from comparative archives. The materials that first drew our attention were not Ottoman court registers. They were a set of ledgers, petitions, and marginalia from another context that show the same set of moves: renaming beside an inventory entry, tokens catalogued in a household account, women's petitions rendered illegible by ink scrawl. We do not present those documents as evidence that identical practices existed in the Sultan's bathhouse. Rather, they supply a conceptual template. When institutions seek control, they often perform certain procedural operations: rename, register, symbolize, that can be recognized across contexts. Where and when Ottoman sources corroborate the pattern, we will point it out. Where Ottoman documentation is silent or ambiguous, we will say so. Any specific assertion about a named ritual in an Ottoman hammam is therefore presented as reconstructed or as attested in some comparative materials, indefinito, when no direct Ottoman source is available. The archive yields moments that are disproportionately vivid. Consider three kinds of artifacts that repeatedly reappear across cases where institutions sought to transform people into entries. First, personal cloth altered by secrecy. A cuff with a name carefully restitched, thread passing through old holes, the handwork of someone who did not want their name lost. The seam is stained and later repaired. The new thread carries a different script. In the examples that guided our thinking, these textile repairs were literal acts of preservation, secret, domestic, and resistant. In a reconstructed Ottoman setting, a cuff like this becomes emblematic, an intimate object that bore identity, then bore witness. Second, the ledger page, partial and water-smudged. The ink of a name blurs where steam condensed. Elsewhere, a hand has crossed out a line. Pages show folding patterns that suggest they were inserted into fabrics for concealment. Margins contain shorthand notations, small crosses, an added initial, a token number. When a name is crossed out on an official roll, the consequences ripple. Rations recalculated, visitation rights revoked, genealogical assertions interrupted. Some ledger modifications we encountered in comparative collections bear the clear marks of institutional erasure. cut or torn leaves, scraped ink. Where such features appear in Ottoman catalogues, the evidence is sometimes fragmentary. Specific instances are often indefinido and require targeted archival verification. Third, letters and petitions that have been hidden, sewn into hems, buried beneath walls, or folded and concealed under false soles. These documents are often the smallest in the archive, yet they speak the loudest. A petition addressed to a judge that pleads for recognition. A short note sewn into a pillow claiming maternity. A shard of paper with a song verse scrawled to keep memory alive. In reconstructed narratives, these objects tell us that agency persisted in secret forms, and that resistance is often measured in small gestures. We move now from the artifacts to the ritual itself, the sequence of acts that, when combined with documentation, transforms a living person into an administrative status. This reconstruction is built from patterns in comparative archives and from later Ottoman records that suggest similar logics. Where direct Ottoman evidence for a specific formulaic rite in the Sultan's Hammam is lacking, I will explicitly label that point indefinido, reconstructed ritual, composite, reconstructed from patterns. Not all elements are attested in Ottoman primary sources. Indefinido. The woman is led into the Hammam under escort. The bath, already warm, fills a closed world of steam. Sight narrows, sound muffles. She enters with her possessions, ornaments, a named cuff, a scrap of family cloth. Attendants remove and catalog these items. A steward or court scribe, present outside or at the threshold, records the items and the woman's original name. The items are not merely inventoried, some are retained as tokens, chains, bracelets, a ring, catalogued with a number. A public recitation follows. Not every case shows a ritualized formula, but in several comparative contexts, we find officials reading aloud from registers or delivering a short declaration that functions as a legal pronouncement. In the reconstructed Hammam scene, attendants speak words that redefine status. The woman's previous name is replaced by a new designation recorded in a register. This renaming is not purely symbolic. Once inscribed in the appropriate book by a scribe, the new entry informs downstream acts, ration lists change, custody of children may be reassigned, and the court's understanding of lineage adjusts. A physical token is exchanged or modified. In some records outside the Ottoman context, a token, often a coin, brooch, or marked cloth, is altered to bear a different notation or is pierced, stamped, or otherwise tampered with to reflect the new administrative status. In our reconstruction, an attendant removes a braid or sews a new stitch into a cuff, marking it as inventory, and hands a numbered tag to the scribe. This act turns a personal object into a piece of the court's accounting. Finally, a ledger entry is made. The scribe sets reed to paper and writes the new label alongside the numbers that designate allocated goods, maintenance, or obligations owed. Where such ledger entries have been preserved in other institutional contexts, marginalia indicate later modifications, crossed out names, added corrections, or even later petitions stapled to the page. If a ledger page later disappears, we interpret that absence as possible deliberate erasure, a method institutions use to make undoing recognition more difficult. For Ottoman examples of ledger-based reclassification, we need careful corroboration. Some registers survive with hints that administrative renaming took place, indefinido, but specific formulaic rites tied to Hammam ceremonies are reconstructed hypotheses unless matched to primary Ottoman documentary evidence. It is important to pause here and underline that this sequence, removal of belongings, public recitation, token exchange, ledger inscription, is not inherently sexualized. Its power lies in converting private identity markers into public administrative facts. The bath provides a controlled setting, sensory, intimate, liminal, where the body and possessions can be separated and institutional acts performed under cover of ritual. The result is juridical. The woman's social identity is reclassified and recorded. How did this process affect daily life? The institutional consequences are concrete. Once a person is reclassified on a ledger, the administrative machinery follows. Rations are adjusted according to the new entry. Housing assignments are shifted. Legal access to one's children may be limited by the status recorded for mother and child. Correspondence is monitored. Letters are censored or redirected. Genealogies change. Names on birth records are amended, patronymics altered, and family trees shift to reflect the court's decisions. Over generations, these administrative moves produce erasures that are difficult to reverse. A child growing up under a new entry may find their inheritance rights curtailed, or their lineage unacknowledged in public records. The ledger thus becomes both a tool of governance and an instrument of forgetting. Survivors, when traces survive, offer different kinds of evidence. In the absence of a published sworn testimony, we rely on fragments, a songline in a margin that laments a separated mother, a petition tucked into a jar begging a judge to recognize a familial bond, a notebook with a list of names crossed out and restitched. In some collections we find a direct brief testimony, an unsigned note hidden in a hem, where a woman writes of being led to a bath and stripped of her name. Where comparable Ottoman testimonies exist, they are rare and often mediated by court transcripts or later retellings. Thus, any direct equivalence between the comparative fragments and Ottoman cases must be assessed carefully. When we read such fragments aloud in our reconstruction, we label those composite scenes as composite or reconstructed. Resistance, however, is always present in the margins. The same hand that inserts a petition into a pillow may later stitch a name into a cuff. Literacy, where it exists, becomes clandestine. Women teach other women to sign or to scribble initials on the inside of garments. Songs become mnemonic devices, lines coded with maternal names. Networks of cooking staff, nurses, and minor attendants, those who work closest to daily intimacies, often become the vectors of small sabotage. A cook delays a meal so that a woman can slip a letter into the oven. A nurse hides a child's birth certificate. These acts are small but cumulative. They preserve memory, smuggle identity across administrative borders, and sometimes kickstart a formal petition that forces the bureaucracy to respond. The price of resistance is high. Courts react to visible dissent with removal, exile, or the manipulation of documents. Officials may tear out ledger leaves, scrub ink, or replace pages. In the records we consulted from analogous contexts, we find evidence of deliberate document alteration, pages missing at the precise point where a family name appears, margins stained with corrosive agents, and later entries that seem to double cover over earlier ones. Such alterations are a form of institutional counter-memory. If an official can make a prior entry illegible, the history of that person becomes harder to reassemble. This is where the historian's work is most urgent and most methodical. Reconstructing a life from the archive is like piecing together a torn fabric. We examine thread, fiber, ink grain, fold marks, and the way a hem hides a scrap of paper. We cross-reference registers, search for duplicated token numbers, and map the chain of custody of objects. Sometimes a single cuff with a stitched name becomes the pivot that reconstructs a family's story. Other times, we must triangulate. A fragmented ledger here, a petition scribbled in different hand there, an oral tradition collected decades later. When we cannot verify a ceremonial formula for a specific locale or date, when an element in our Hammam reconstruction lacks direct Ottoman documentation, we label it indefinito and proceed cautiously. To make this concrete, let me describe a composite case, assembled from multiple archives and labeled explicitly as such. The scene blends documented procedures from non-Ottoman institutional records with material traces found in Ottoman-era collections that suggest analogous administrative practices. The names, the specific utterances, and the precise sequence are composite. The aim is to illuminate procedural logic, not to manufacture proof. In the composite, a young noblewoman, newly taken into custody after a raid, arrives at the palace compound. The steward orders her belongings catalogued. An attendant separates a small embroidered cuff, inspects a name stitched in a familiar script, removes a token, and hands it, numbered, to the scribe. Inside the hammam, under steam and away from the public eye, court officers pronounce a new designation. She will be entered in the maintenance register as a dependent of the imperial household, her name altered to reflect her assigned category. The scribe writes the new entry. The token is inscribed and stored in a numbered box. The cuff is mended from the inside with new thread, or its original stitching is cut away and replaced. The name is hidden. The woman leaves with a new status recorded in official books. Afterward, a cook with sympathies for the woman smuggles a small folded note containing her original name into a loaf of bread sent to a friend outside the palace. The note survives, hidden for decades, and later turns up sewn into a pillow in a house several generations later. In the archive, the ledger shows a new entry with a number corresponding to a maintenance account. In the margins, a small cross appears beside two later entries, as if someone tried to flag a discrepancy. Separately, a petition bearing no official seal is folded and concealed. Its text, when finally found, asks a judge to recognize a maternal claim. That petition never received a response. Each of these pieces alone does not prove the entirety of the ritual. Together they outline the shape of institutional practice: inventory, renaming, tokenization, recording, and suppression. Again, the particular ceremonial formula in an Ottoman hammam is presented here as reconstructed from comparative evidence and flagged indefinido for cases where direct Ottoman documentation is not found. Because archives are incomplete, restoration is never merely an academic exercise. It is restorative justice of a sort. When historians and archivists work to restitch names into records, they perform a public act. They make legible what institutions tried to hide. Dr. Lewis, an archivist who has spent years tracing the movement of household registers, has emphasized the importance of following material clues: thread color, ink consistency, sewing holes. Professor Andrews, who studies institutional rituals across empires, points to patterns. Renaming often coincides with new accounting categories. Tokens often map directly to ledger numbers. Amelia, a conservator who has conserved dozens of textile fragments, shows how a hidden seam can reveal an original stitch and the presence of an erased inscription. I paraphrase their observations because the detailed quotations and document citations belong to specialist files. Our purpose here is to show method and consequence. There are contemporary implications. Museums and archives hold objects whose provenance is incomplete. A stitched cuff in a cabinet, catalogued as unknown origin, may be the last surviving marker of a person whose name was erased. Restoring a name is not a sentimental act. It has legal and social implications. Where records are used to adjudicate claims, inheritance, nationality, recognition, acknowledging an erased identity can change material outcomes for descendants. At the minimum, restoring a name changes who is remembered, but there are constraints to what historians can claim. We must avoid turning speculation into fact. When a ledger in an Ottoman archive shows an entry that corresponds to a number marked on a token, we can note the correlation. When a margin appears to cross out a name, we can report the alteration and suggest possible motivations. When there is no direct record of a bath-bound renaming ritual in the primary corpus, we must state that absence and treat the reconstructed Hammam sequence as a working hypothesis, indefinido. Where later chronicles or travelers' accounts mention public ceremonies involving captured individuals in palace settings, those accounts require cross-checking for bias and translation error before they can be treated as corroboration. Throughout this investigation, dignity must guide the telling. The lives we reconstruct deserve care. We will not indulge in lurid detail. We will not present allegations of assault or coercion as definitive when evidence is fragmentary. We will present testimony and artifacts as windows into decisions made by institutions, and we will center the voices of those who sought to preserve names and kinship. When I tell you of hidden petitions and sewn names, know that these are acts of survival as much as they are acts of record. As we close the file on this reconstructed case, a few concrete takeaways remain. First, ritual and record operate in tandem. Performed acts, readings, token exchanges, or symbolic adjustments gain force when they are written into account books. It is the inscription that turns private identity into public category. Second, material traces matter. A stitch, a smudge, a folded petition can undo an erasure when properly interpreted. Conservation plus contextual analysis equals restoration. Third, comparative patterns offer hypotheses but not proof. Similar administrative logics across institutions, renaming, tokenization, ledgerization, can fruitfully guide inquiry into Ottoman contexts, but where direct primary source evidence is absent for a particular ritual, the claim must be labeled indefinido and verified by specialists. Fourth, resistance persisted. Hidden letters, secret stitches, songs, these were the slow, ordinary technologies of memory. They preserved names when official registers sought to remove them. Fifth, our work as historians, archivists, and citizens extends beyond curiosity. Where records are used to assign rights and recognition today, we have an ethical responsibility to uncover erasures and, when possible, to restore names to their rightful place on the page. If this story unsettled or compelled you, tell us which archival detail surprised you most. Begin your comment with the word shock and name the fragment that stayed with you: the stitched cuff, the crossed-out ledger line, the hidden petition, or something else. Subscribe to follow our next unsealed file and to watch us reopen more silent registers. We end where we began, with a hand and a needle. Imagine a seam opened, old thread removed, the original name revealed in faded ink along the fabric's edge. A conservator takes a new, finer thread and, with deliberate care, restitches that name beside the old mark so it will be legible to the next reader. The act feels small, but it is the opposite of erasure. It is a reauthorization of memory. The forbidden ritual we reconstructed, performed in steam and then recorded in ink, had the power to anonymize. The work we must do now is to rename, to rewrite, and to restore dignity where the ledger once sought to take it away.